dive in. Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show dedicated to giving you the fastest route to being the most informed person in the room. Today, we are tackling a really fascinating stack of sources. They detail what can only be described as a revolutionary philosophical map. It's actually a living model of post-colonial existence, and the sources claim it's being successfully realized right now, today, in the Kenema district of Sierra Leone, West Africa.
It's definitely unique material, and I think the key thing here is that this isn't just theory, being debated abstractly in a university somewhere. We're looking at a sustained praxis, that's the word they use, a practical realization being undertaken by a specific community on the ground. And the sources, they really detail this commitment they have to sacramental anthropology and hand-on modernity. That's the phrase. It seems focused entirely on achieving, comprehensive autonomy and self-sufficiency, really bypassing the traditional frameworks, especially those inherited from colonialism.
Right, so our mission today, our deep dive, is to decode this incredibly dense 14-part philosophical engine that's apparently driving the whole project.
Yeah.
It's called the double transversal transjective quadratic model. Thankfully, they shorten it to delta TT2DEM.
Yes, thankfully.
It sounds incredibly technical, almost like something out of theoretical physics. But it serves as their instructional guide, doesn't it, for transforming the absolute fundamentals of life. We're talking how they speak, how they manage their economy, how they practice faith, even how they, literally hold their bodies. And all of this feeds into what the sources call the living flat metabolism.
That's the goal state. And the initial hook, I think the real reason this model even exists is its core function, which is basically replacing traditional top-down vertical hierarchies, the whole legacy of colonial power structures, replacing that with a system built entirely on reciprocal reflection and, crucially, on continuous collective healing.
Okay, and here's the part that really grabbed me, the kicker that should probably grab you listening to. The primary mechanism for this profound healing, the very source of their sovereignty. It's literally woven into the fabric of communication itself.
Yeah, language.
The model claims to heal collective trauma through reforming grammar. Just think about that. Revolution by syntax.
It's a radical claim.
It really is. Okay, so let's unpack this intricate structure. We have to start with the very first principles, right?
Yeah.
So we begin with the architecture, point 1 of the 14 parts, what the community calls the quadratic genesis. Now, when we first try to understand delta TTO2, the sources immediately state something quite specific. They say it originates as a metabolic model, not a diagram. I think we have to spend some real time on that distinction. What does it fundamentally mean for the model to be metabolic?
It's probably the single most crucial distinction for understanding the whole thing, actually. Because a diagram is static, isn't it? It shows connections at one moment in time, like a snapshot, an organizational chart frozen. But a metabolic model that's alive, it's conceived as a living system concerned with continuous organic transformation. Think of it like a biological system. It has to always digest reality, always transform it, always excrete waste, and always renew the material it engages with.
Okay, so the structure itself is alive.
Exactly. It's constantly circulating knowledge, resources, power, everything is in flow.
Which means if it's constantly digesting reality, it can never become fixed dogma. It can't harden.
Precisely. It's designed against that. Its internal grammar, as they describe it, fuses geometry with theology, and it operates on these 4 axes that are perpetually cycling. And this continuous cycle, this is important, it replaces rigid hierarchy, the static chain of command, with something the authors call harmonic recursion.
Harmonic recursion, okay.
It's designed to be a self-tuning system, almost, self-correcting. It finds stability through constant movement, kind of like a gyroscope stays upright by spinning.
That phrase, harmonic recursion, really implies a rhythm, doesn't it? A pattern of returning, but always slightly changed, maybe?
Yes, exactly. And the name itself, delta T22, we should break that down. Each of those 4 terms, double, transversal, transjective, and quadratic, is doing some really heavy conceptual lifting.
Right. Let's take them one by one.
Okay. So the double is the first principle. It essentially mandates reciprocal reflection between the idea and the act. There has to be this immediate feedback loop. The thought, the concept, and the material manifestation, they have to constantly validate each other, check each other. It keeps the whole thing grounded in the material reality there in Kenema.
That sounds like a powerful check against, theory just spinning off on its own, disconnected from practice.
It absolutely is. It's built-in grounding. Then next is transversal. This is crucial for how knowledge moves around. It defines the structure of intellectual engagement. It demands that the system cut across all the traditional disciplines we think of. So philosophy, agriculture, engineering, worship, everything. It's designed specifically to prevent what they call epistemic silos.
Ah, preventing knowledge hoarding.
Exactly. No specialized knowledge is allowed to just exist in isolation or, worse, become proprietary, held by a small class of elites. It has to flow.
Okay. And then transjective. That immediately signals something very different from typical Western ways of seeing the world.
Precisely. Transjective binds the observer and the environment together into one mutual connection. There's simply no passive viewing in this model. If you are there, you are implicated. You are part of the reality you perceive, your seeing is doing.
Wow. Okay. And finally, the quadratic.
The quadratic defines that rhythmic pulse we mentioned, the sort of self-tuning metabolic beat. It's governed by 4 states or phases that make up the system's energy cycle. Ultra, extra, meta, and intra. We'll get more into those later.
Right. But here's that really counterintuitive point you touched on, reinforcing the metabolic nature. The sources say each rotation, each cycle through these phases births coherence through displacement, not stability. We usually think of stability as things staying put, right? Fixity, standing still.
And this is, well, I think it's the genius of the design, really. It's how the community avoids becoming intellectually static or rigid. Meaning itself behaves like flow in this model.
Yeah.
Like water or breath. The source says it never encloses. So if meaning is always in motion, it can't be captured easily, it can't ossify, it can't be weaponized into dogma or used to build a fixed power structure.
It stays fluid.
Exactly. The entire project seems founded on this idea that Delta T22 begins where ontology, the study of existence itself, learns to breathe. Existence defined by vital, self-sustaining circulation.
That circulation idea, that flow, it brings us directly to the model's most fundamental, maybe most revolutionary claim. Point 2, ontological flatness. This is the absolute total rejection of vertical hierarchy. And this is where the practical political implications for this community in Kenema become, well, massive.
Yes, flatness is positioned explicitly as the antidote to colonial hierarchy. It's defined as relational equality across all entities. And that means humans, spiritual forces, material objects, the soil itself, everything on the same plane. It's a fundamental reversal of the entire historical power structure imposed on them, which was, by definition, superior over subordinate.
But okay, how does that actually work on a spiritual and social level? I mean, if knowledge and divinity don't ascend vertically to a priest or a chief or some governor figure,
Yeah.
where do they reside? How does that manifest?
Well, according to the model, they diffuse horizontally, laterally. Divinity, in this framework, isn't located up there at some distant transcendent peak. It's understood as immediately immanent, spreading sideways, you could say, through kinship ties, through the soil they cultivate, through the craft they perform with their hands.
So it's in the relationships and the actions.
Exactly. And knowledge stops its upward climb towards some elite class. Instead, it circulates among the actual practitioners, the people who use it every single day. And the source claims this abolition of verticality is precisely what produces. Well, the phrase they use is civic tenderness instead of command.
Civic tenderness, that's an intense phrase. It suggests the whole political structure becomes gentle by its very nature, because there's no mechanism for one entity to dominate another.
That's the idea. But let's push on that. Like you said, what does governance actually look like day to day when there's no mayor, no chief, no vertical authority structure? How do they decide on, say, a communal budget?
Yeah.
Or allocate resources?
Yeah, the practicality.
That's the critical challenge. And the model offers a radical answer. Governance in this flat model isn't based on democratic voting or majority rule, because even that can create hierarchies of influence, right? Instead, every object, every tool, every resource, every person is seen as a node of mutual grace. Power itself gets fundamentally redefined. Governance emerges as resonance, not rulership. Decisions are arrived at through the community aligning their metabolic rhythms, their collective energy, until they achieve that necessary harmonic recursion.
So it's almost like tuning a massive orchestra. When everyone is resonating together, the decision is effectively made. There's an alignment.
Precisely. That's a good analogy. And the ultimate political act, therefore, isn't issuing a decree or extracting resources. It's maintenance.
Maintenance.
Power is converted into maintenance. The world, the community, is held together by shared repair, by shared labor, by the relentless act of tending to things. To act flatly in this view is to mirror divine immanence, to embody that horizontal flow of grace. And this commitment to maintenance as the highest political action is exactly how the community aims to achieve and sustain its autonomy, its self-sufficiency through care.
Okay, so moving from that abstract genesis, the blueprint, to the model and dynamic action. We come back to transjectivity, point 3. We know it fuses subject and object. But how does this shift from, say, passive observation to active participation change the practical everyday labor in Kenema?
Right. This is where the metaphysical claim becomes, well, practical engineering on the ground.
Yeah.
The aha moment here, as the source puts it, is that perception becomes participation. So when the community observes a field, for instance, they aren't just looking at a resource separate from them. They understand themselves as co-creating its potential reality through the act of observing and interacting. Well, their observation alters the environment because it immediately initiates a reciprocal relationship. This completely rejects that detached colonial scientific model of observation, the observer standing apart. Here, it's replaced with profound reciprocity. Engagement.
You mentioned observation altering the environment. Can we make that more concrete? If I'm standing in a field that's being planted, how does my consciousness actually behave as architecture? What does that mean practically?
Okay, good question. It's maybe the difference between seeing a plant as just a thing, an object over there, versus seeing it as potential food within a whole system. If you see it as just a discrete object, maybe you just take from it. But if your consciousness behaves as architecture, you immediately recognize the complex web of needs involved. You see the soil quality needed, the water requirements, its symbiotic relationship with other plants nearby, and your observation generates an immediate, tangible feedback loop that compels you to act appropriately within that system.
So the seeing includes the responsibility.
Exactly. That action is the architectural intervention.
Yeah.
Your perception shapes your interaction, which shapes the reality.
So every encounter, whether it's with another person or a resource like water or soil, it's an ontological handshake. Transjectivity means there's no comfortable distance. You can't just stand back.
Zero distance. Consciousness is actively generating feedback rather than maintaining distance. And this system demands accountability, doesn't it? Because if you are participating in the creation of reality through your perception and your labor, then the whole quest for objective truth changes entirely.
Right. If I'm co-building reality, then truth can't be some fixed concept handed down from on high or found out there. So what is truth under delta T22? How do they define it?
Truth in this model emerges through circulation. It's not based on assertion. Truth is essentially what successfully maintains the metabolic flow of the community. It's what works, what sustains, what repairs. It's practical, embodied truth.
And error. Mistakes.
Error is simply understood as an asymmetrical rhythm, a moment when the subject and object, or maybe the individual in the community, are out of sync, failing to co-build harmoniously. A disruption in the flow.
Okay.
Therefore, to truly know something in this framework is to co-build it, to participate in its maintenance. This shifts knowledge away from being an abstract possession you hold in your head to being a highly valued form of shared labor, shared maintenance, practical skill.
Which makes knowledge inherently useful for self-sufficiency, doesn't it? It has to be practical. Okay, let's move to point 4, quadratic symmetry. This revisits that rhythmic pulse you mentioned, ultra, extra, meta, and intra. And this metabolic symmetry is how the system ensures its continuous operation, its flow.
Yes, we have to understand this as the operational sequence. The 4 axes, ultra, extra, meta, intra, they describe the sequence of energy exchange within the system. It's how an abstract concept gets transformed into an embodied practical reality on the ground, and then how that reality feeds back into the system, restarting the cycle. It's the engine's firing order, if you like.
Okay, walk us through a practical example of this rhythmic pulse. Maybe apply it to that decision-making process we talked about. Let's say initiating a new communal project, like building a new water catchment system in Kenema. How would the quadratic cycle work?
Oh, that's a perfect application. Okay, so the process begins with ultra. Ultra ignites. This is the initial spark of need, the energetic recognition of the problem. So the thought arises. We need a more resilient way to collect water. It's that moment of maximum potential energy, the initial impulse.
Right, the need is felt. Then extra takes that spark and organizes it.
Exactly. Extra organizes the ignition into structure. This is the planning phase. Okay, how many materials do we actually need? Where's the best location geologically? Who in the community has the necessary skills? Extra establishes the conceptual architecture for the project. Put some form around the initial impulse.
Okay, planned out. Next comes meta.
Meta verifies. This is the critical review phase, the check. It asks the crucial questions. Does this proposed structure align with our core principles of ontological flatness? Does it require external hierarchical aid we want to avoid? Does it maintain harmonic recursion with our other systems? It verifies the coherence and integrity of the plan against the entire delta T22 model.
And if it fails that verification?
If it fails meta verification, it doesn't just get scrapped necessarily. It might return to extra for replanning or even back to ultra for reignition. Maybe the initial need wasn't understood correctly. It's iterative.
Got it. And finally, if it passes meta, it moves to intra.
Intra incarnates. This is the physical realization, the embodiment. It's the actual collective labor of building the catchment system, bringing the verified concept back into physical reality, grounding the knowledge in the flesh, the tools, the soil, the shared effort. And crucially, once that system is built, it begins generating new needs, new data, new knowledge. And the cycle immediately restarts, ensuring the theoretical breakthroughs always return as practical, self-sufficient action. It keeps moving.
Now we get to what feels like the core mechanism of renewal in this model. Starting with point 5, linguistogenesis. This is the assertion that language isn't just a tool for communication, it's the first infrastructure of existence. The sources actually claim that words don't just describe the world, they construct it.
This really elevates linguistics, doesn't it? It puts it on the level of like civil engineering or architecture. Because if their goal is radical self-sufficiency and post-colonial autonomy, they fundamentally cannot afford to use a language inherited wholesale from a system of subjugation.
Because the old language keeps you trapped in the old world's logic.
Exactly. To use the old language is to risk perpetuating the old ways of thinking, the old hierarchies. Therefore, they believe they must literally invent the world they wish to live in. And the very initial building blocks for that world are words, new words.
So the community's entire project of sovereignty actually begins with designing new semantics, new meanings.
Absolutely. And the method they employ for this is called verb forging. This deliberately shifts the purpose of speech away from just passive commentary, so away from just describing what already exists, towards active creation, making things happen with words. Semantics, in this view, evolve like biology. Each new term they forge is designed very specifically to perform conceptual labor within the system. It might be designed to build a specific connection or enforce a specific pattern of behavior. Linguistogenesis is, in effect, Genesis creation replayed in syntax.
Wow.
If they seek independence, they have to invent the grammar of independence first.
That leads us directly into point 6, etymological hybridization, which sounds like the active engineering of this new lexicon, fusing linguistic roots together to construct those new ontologies, those new ways of being. And this is where we see the post-colonial application really taking shape, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, because in almost any post-colonial setting, the mixture of languages, the blending of the colonizer's tongue with indigenous roots, it's often seen negatively as a sign of degradation. Or impurity, maybe. A failure to maintain cultural boundaries.
Right, something lost.
But here, mixture is radically redefined. It's treated as revelation, as a source of strength. Cross-tongue lexemes words made from blending different language roots are specifically engineered. The purpose is to heal the deep cultural fractures and historical schisms left by the colonial project, to weave things back together.
So the very sound of the new language, the way it blends sources, is intended as an act of diplomacy. Of reconciliation.
Precisely. The sources use this powerful image they describe the mouth as the workshop of reconciliation. Hybridization here is about translating historical trauma into living grammar. It reframes the painful past, not as some static burden you just have to passively accept, but as raw, fertile material for syntactical creation, for building something new.
That phrase allows dust to speak multiple genealogies at once.
Yes. The dust being the fragments of history, the cultural loss, the linguistic damage. By weaving those fragments together into new words, they aim to create a language that simultaneously acknowledges the pain and transcends it. It holds both.
And the ultimate political goal here seems profound. What they call Afrooptimist origination.
Yes. It's about replacing that default state you often find colonial mimicry, the necessity of adopting the master's tools in language just to function, replacing that with confident, active invention based on their own synthesized past and their desired future. So, to mix words in this context is the literal act of mending worlds. It's repair through language.
Okay, but such a philosophical approach to language needs a rigorous methodology, right? Yeah. Otherwise, wouldn't the language just devolve into chaos or personal invention that nobody else understands?
Exactly. And that brings us to point 7, the Play Lesotho Protocol. This formalizes verb forging. It turns it into a crucial civic craft within the Kenema community, a shared discipline.
So what is this protocol? What are the rules?
The Play-Lesoto Protocol is essentially their constitutional rulebook for linguistic invention. It mandates strict criteria for any new word that's proposed. First, they must be short, easily spoken. Second, highly resonant, they have to feel right somehow. Third, easily repeatable, memorable. But the most important mandate is functional. Each new word must be designed specifically to alter behavior, to make something happen.
Not just describe, but change action.
Precisely. If the word doesn't function as a kind of kinetic trigger, changing how people interact with the world or each other, it's considered useless. It fails the protocol.
Okay, the word has to fundamentally change behavior. But this brings up a really practical challenge. If the efficacy of a new word isn't judged by, say, intellectual debate or logical argument, how do they verify that these forged verbs actually work? How do they test them?
And this is where the model becomes radically non-intellectual or perhaps post-intellectual. Testing occurs through breath, not debate.
Through breath, what does that mean?
A word's success isn't judged by its logical consistency on paper or how well someone can argue for it. It's judged by its ability to be effortlessly integrated into the community's shared respiration, their shared rhythm, their shared labor. If the word requires explanation, if it feels awkward, if it takes effort to integrate into that metabolic flow of community life, it fails. It hasn't become part of the collective breath.
That sounds beautiful in a way, but isn't relying on breath, not debate, potentially, well, maybe anti-democratic, or maybe dangerously subject to emotional influence rather than reason?
Right.
What if the community needs time to intellectually process a complex new concept embodied in a word?
That's certainly the critical challenge for any external observer looking in. The model, however, asserts that the kind of deep change they're aiming for, the kind required to break those deeply ingrained habits of hierarchy and colonial mentality, is fundamentally somatic. It happens in the body, not just the intellect. Intellectual processing, from this perspective, can actually create distance, whereas breath creates immediacy, incorporation. If a word requires debate, it already implies a kind of verticality of knowledge, one person needing to explain it down to another.
Okay.
And the metric for failure is what makes the system so effective, potentially, at avoiding manipulation or just endless argument. Failure equals silence in the courtyard.
Silence in the courtyard. That's a very memorable detail from the sources.
It really is. If a proposed word fails to integrate, if it fails to induce the desired somatic shift, the community simply stops using it. It's not publicly scorned, it's not argued away in a meeting, it just falls out of circulation, it's met with silence. This is described as their clear civic mechanism for linguistic hygiene. It prevents clutter and ensures that only verbs that truly propel the community towards self-sufficiency actually survive and get used.
This process then leads directly into point 8, verbokinetic insurgency, which sounds like the practical application of these successful Play-Lesoto verbs. What does it mean for a word to become a kinetic device?
It means the forged verbs, the ones that pass the breath test, are used intentionally to induce actual physical, perceptual, and somatic shifts in people. Think about ingrained colonial postures, maybe. Deference, looking down, waiting passively for command, planning everything in a rigid, linear way. Verbokinetic insurgency uses the rhythmic repetition of a specific forged verb to actively disrupt that ingrained physical and mental programming.
Okay, can you give us an example? If they invent a word, let's just make one up, blending local roots, say kulasula, meaning maybe gather and repair together.
Yeah.
How does that single word create a revolution by rhythm?
Right. So if kulasula is successful under the Play-Lesoto protocol, it's short, resonant, behavior-altering, then its rhythmic chanting during communal labor acts as that kinetic device. It doesn't just remind people to work together. The rhythm itself compels a specific posture of cooperation. Maybe it ensures a unified timing for strenuous physical labor. And it actively disrupts the individual tendency to maybe wait for a boss figure to delegate tasks.
The sound itself organizes the action.
Yes. The repetition is the revolution in miniature. It coordinates individual bodies into collective action, physically enforcing the principles of flatness and resonance. It is, quite literally, as the source describes it, revolution by rhythm, moving the community past just intellectualizing change into actually embodying it, moment by moment.
So this whole linguistic infrastructure, this verb forging and kinetic insurgency, it lays the groundwork for their wider social mission. Which brings us to point 11, post-colonial neoculturation. The sources state, this is the explicit goal of the Kenema project. generating culture from origination, rather than just from opposition to the past.
This really represents the mature political stance of the entire model, I think. Because if you define yourself purely in opposition to the colonial past, you're actually forever locked in a reactive dynamic, aren't you? You remain tethered to the trauma, defined by what you're fighting against. Neoculturation is about consciously turning away from the past as a chain that binds you, and instead actively generating culture from the future you want to build through confident invention in the present.
So how do they handle the painful history then? The history they are trying to escape or transform, they don't just ignore it.
No, not ignore it, they convert it. History, in this framework, is treated not as a chain of oppression that binds them forever, but as compost.
Compost.
Yes, as the nutrient base for new growth. The fragments of the colonial lexicon, the remnants of imposed systems, the memories of conflict, all of that becomes raw material. Material that feeds the new growth of their sovereignty. Mixture, which we talked about with hybridization, becomes the primary agent of agency here, taking the broken pieces and making something new and stronger.
So the political goal of, say, not needing external aid or not defining their worth by external metrics anymore, that really starts with this linguistic and cultural self-creation. Every new word, as the source puts it, is a sovereignty cell.
Precisely. Reaction gets replaced by invention. Every single word that successfully passes the Play-Lesoto protocol is seen as a tiny functional unit of self-determination. And this allows for a really radical definition of self, of identity. Identity becomes experimental, not inherited.
Experimental, not inherited.
Yes. It's presented as an ongoing active choice of creation, a constant process, rather than some passive static inheritance handed down that you just have to accept.
That's a fundamentally liberating concept, isn't it? It suggests that freedom itself is a creative process. You have to keep making it.
It is. Freedom equals linguistic fertility in this model. The ability of the community to continually invent the language of their shared reality is the measure of their ongoing sovereignty and autonomy. It's the core of what the sources call the politics of creative calm, achieving self-determination not through fighting, but through confident, self-reliant, ongoing creation, building their world from within.
Okay, let's turn now to the spiritual and healing dimension of this model, starting with point 10, sacramental anthropology. How does this model understand the fundamental nature of humanity? What are we?
Humanity, in this view, is understood as Eucharistic metabolism. That's a really powerful, integrated concept. It means we are fundamentally beings that constantly consume, transform, and participate in the continuous creation of reality. We're always in this loop of giving and receiving grace. And grace here isn't just spiritual. It includes material sustenance, knowledge, energy. Everything flows. Therefore, observation itself in this system equals participation in grace. To simply see the world, to engage with it, is to be part of its ongoing, sacred unfolding. And to maintain that unfolding, to repair it, that is worship.
So this elevates the everyday labor, the work needed for self-sufficiency. It makes it sacred.
Absolutely. Work sacralizes matter. The seemingly mundane labor, the planting, the repairing of tools, the gathering of resources necessary for the community's autonomy, all of that is elevated to a profound spiritual practice. And embodiment is the epistemic source. The body itself is where knowledge is ultimately tested, stored, and verified. The sacred, they believe, hides in repetition, in the rhythms of day-to-day maintenance, not in grand pronouncements or singular events.
So to live is, fundamentally, to keep creation repaired.
That's the essence of it, to participate in the ongoing maintenance of the world.
And this commitment to repair seems to be the foundation for their unique approach to healing. Point 9, exopsychoanalysis. Healing from the outside in.
Yes, it's a radical break from Western psychological models that focus primarily on internal dialogue, introspection, analyzing the past. Exopsychoanalysis mandates that healing is displaced from introspection to shared labor. It deliberately shifts the focus away from analyzing internal conflicts towards repairing and building the shared external world, the world you inhabit together.
So if someone in the community is suffering from, say, trauma or significant psychological distress, the primary solution isn't talk therapy, it's action. Shared action.
Precisely. If the world is held together by shared repair, as the model posits, then actively participating in that repair is the direct path to both personal and collective restoration. So jointly building a necessary communal structure, or working the soil together, or mastering the craft of a new, useful technology, these actions become the therapy.
It builds instead of just explains.
Exactly. By focusing the energy of distress outward into constructive shared labor, they believe they are simultaneously healing the self, the community, and the material world around them. It reinforces that whole metabolic loop of care and reciprocity.
Okay, we've established the linguistic insurgency, the idea of culture as compost, and this sacramental view of work and healing. We now need to examine how the abstract spiritual and conceptual knowledge of delta T2-2 is made concrete, made physical reality. This starts with point 12. Teleotheontological faith. It's quite a mouthful.
It is. Teleotheontological faith. It's a complex term, but it defines a faith that is entirely coded for the commons, for the collective, not individualistic. It's three-parter. Tele, meaning distant, referring to the shared future goal. Theo, divine, the principles of relational equality and grace. And onto, embodied the here and now in the flesh. So it's a faith that exists simultaneously on the distant horizon of their shared future, grounded in the divine principles of flatness and reciprocity, and manifested in the immediate physical actions of the practitioners, all at once.
It sounds like a faith that demands continuous action then, not just passive belief. So how is something like doubt treated in such a, well, seemingly rigorous system?
That's a great question. Doubt, which can cripple many traditional faith models, is actually redefined here. It's seen as latency, not failure.
Latency, meaning?
Meaning it's simply potential energy waiting to be realized. It's perhaps an unformed question, a necessary stage in the process of understanding or integration, not some destructive element that needs to be suppressed or argued away. It's part of the cycle.
Okay. And if faith is this active embodied process, then worship itself must also change significantly from traditional forms.
It does. Worship equals calibration, that's the term used. The act of gathering, the act of shared ritual, is primarily about bringing one's personal interior practice, their body posture, their breathing, their kinetic engagement with the world, into resonant alignment with the collective metabolic flow of the community.
Tuning into the group frequency.
Exactly. Teleotheontology is spirituality coded entirely for the commons, for the we, not for individual, private salvation or enlightenment.
And this alignment, this calibration, leads us directly into the next point, number 13, intra-embodiment. This is the stage where theory finally returns to flesh, closing the loop that started way back with the quadratic genesis.
Yes, this is where the entire knowledge system becomes intensely physical. The ultimate goal of learning within delta T22 is not abstract intellectual understanding, or even just the ability to articulate a concept eloquently. It culminates in sensation, in the body. The body is the final arbiter of truth, the ultimate testing ground.
What are the consequences of that belief for how knowledge is actually taught or transmitted within the community?
Well, the sources state quite clearly, body posture stores epistemology.
Scores epistemology.
How? Your stance, your gait, your habitual ways of holding a tool, how you physically interact with a neighbor. These physical practices are the literal archive of your knowledge within the system. So if your body posture consistently contradicts the principles of ontological flatness, maybe you habitually stand over people or move in a way that disrupts communal rhythm, your knowledge is considered flawed, incomplete, regardless of what you might say or argue intellectually.
That really means they must prioritize craft and skill and that idea of maintenance over abstract theory, right? If, as the source says, hands remember faster than concepts, what does that prioritize in daily life?
It prioritizes the somatic experience, the felt sense, over the abstract definition every single time. Intra-knowledge, the embodied knowledge, feels before it knows. It prioritizes the mastery of the craft of care. The final step in comprehension isn't necessarily a successful articulation in a debate. It's often described as silence, a kind of knowing calm.
Silence finalizes comprehension.
Yes. Embodiment closes the entire delta T22 loop by touch, by action, by physical presence, ensuring that the self-sufficient realization they're aiming for in Kenema is deeply rooted in the physical reality and shared habits of the participants, not just floating in ideas.
Okay, we have now traced this model through all 13 prior points, from its abstract genesis all the way to physical embodiment. We need to look at the final aim, the ultimate goal. What is the overarching purpose of the delta TT2 model being realized in Kenema? This is point 14, the prometatopian synthesis.
Right. Delta T22 aims toward prometatopia, which is defined as the covenantal future, a future built on shared promise and responsibility built fundamentally by maintenance. It's a careful synthesis of the pragmatic, the hands-on, and the aspirational, the vision. And notice the word, it's not utopia.
Right, not utopia.
Utopia is often conceived as a perfect, static, probably unreachable place. Prometatopia is different. It's perpetually in the making. It is the promise of the future being realized through continuous present action, through the work.
So they are fundamentally redefining progress itself, moving away from that linear reach-the-finish line concept we often rely on in the West.
Exactly. Progress becomes recursive repair. You are not striving to reach some final destination, but rather to perfect the ongoing act of fixing, nurturing, and maintaining the system as it cycles, keeping the flow going. And technology, in this context, the design of their water systems, their tools, their agricultural methods, is consciously reconciled with theology, not through ritual or dogma, but through the shared, active, daily labor of care. That synthesis is the ultimate expression of their self-sufficiency.
And this continuous loop, integrating language, economy, faith, and embodiment across all these 14 components, this is the definition of the living flat metabolism. It's like a machine designed to run eternally on its own recursive repair.
Beautifully put. And this final, elegant synthesis provides what the sources present as the ultimate philosophical conclusion, the insight that ties everything we've discussed together.
Handotheology.
Handotheology. The overarching insight being that maintenance is theology. Yes. Simply put, in this system, the physical act of shared recursive repair, the literal craft of caring for the community, its resources, its language, its relationships, is the highest spiritual and political act. Ontology itself, the very nature of existence, is defined fundamentally as a craft of care. That is handotheology, and that seems to be the core identity of this profoundly ambitious, self-sufficient project emerging in Sierra Leone.
That is an immense amount of ground we've covered. Really complex, interwoven ideas. We began by looking at what the sources describe as a successful realization of a complex post-colonial praxis happening right now in Kenema, Sierra Leone, focused entirely on achieving autonomy and self-sufficiency. And the sources sometimes refer to this specific group as the Maison of Noni Lapierre neotribal family community. That seems to be the specific context.
Right. And we've worked through decoding the Delta TT22 model, tracing its path from this initial idea of a metabolic concept through to a linguistic revolution where words become kinetal devices, all the way to a system where progress is defined as recursive repair and knowledge is literally stored in your body posture, verified through action.
So what does this all mean when we try to connect it back to the bigger picture for you listening?
Yeah.
I think the core takeaway from this entire model, if the sources are accurate, is the total abolition of verticality in knowledge, in power, in faith, replacing all that with a relational equality.
Flatness.
And the fundamental understanding that care, meaning maintenance, co-building, recursive repair, is the highest form of theology, the highest value.
It's a philosophy that seems designed to transform every citizen into a sovereign caretaker, someone perpetually co-building their own future through practical action and shared responsibility.
And as the sources really emphasize, particularly in that idea of post-colonial neoculturation, identity is experimental, not inherited.
Yes, that constant, active, self-aware process of self-creation, driven by language and action, not by fixed tradition or external definition.
A truly challenging and, well, maybe beautiful idea. So here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on based on everything we've unpacked today. If you were to apply this concept, this Afrooptimist origination and recursive repair to your own life, if you accept, even just for a moment, that your identity is an ongoing experiment, what single word, if you introduced it into your own lexicon using the Playlist Soda protocol, remember, short, resonant, repeatable, and designed to alter behavior, what word would represent your personal ongoing act of recursive repair?
Something to take from this deep dive into your own existence, perhaps. We invite you to find that word, breathe it into your life, and maybe see what kinetic shift it creates.
Absolutely. Something to think about. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.